Well, good morning. Continuing on this next session, Changing Tides, the U.S. Navy's World War II transformations in people and systems as we shift gears. This session explores how World War II reshaped the United States Navy as an institution, both socially and technologically. Trent Hone examines the Navy's rapid evolution in organization, innovation, operational systems that really define modern naval warfare and the Navy's service culture today. Historian Frank Blazich will highlight the service and legacy of Black Seabees and the implications for America's integrated military today as well. Now, chairing our session is Dr. Sean Scanlon. Sean joined the Jenny Craig Institute in summer 2004. Of course, we put him to work on a number of things, but in particular, on our Arizona State University Master's in World War II Studies, but also as the lead for our Normandy Academy program, where we, with Nicholls State University, take college students to Normandy as part of an incredible opportunity there. So at this moment, I'm going to turn over to Sean. Sean, over to you for the Navy in transformation.
Brilliant. Well, thanks very much, Mike. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back. It's a pleasure to be back here at my second international conference. I'm really excited for this panel because I think it provides a unique window into how the U.S. military fought World War II. Usually, when we talk about the Second World War, we focus on combat, military commanders, important units, and specific individuals. And certainly we've seen a great deal of that today and yesterday. Seldom, however, do we think about topics such as personnel policy, where U.S. officials have to determine how to best utilize the United States manpower resources in order to achieve success in the battlefield. That becomes even more complicated when that personnel policy has to contend with the U.S. military's history of racial segregation. Likewise, when we talk about specific battles or campaigns, we seldom stop to consider how military leaders absorb the lessons of past campaigns and turn them into successful future operations. We're going to explore these themes today through the lens of one military branch, the U.S. Navy, with two excellent panelists who have studied and written extensively about the development of Navy personnel policy and combat doctrine during World War II. Collectively, their work reminds us that the United States Navy was not a static institution, but one that adapted and learned over the course of the Second World War. Our first panelist will be Trent Hone. Trent is the Marine Corps University Foundation Chair of Strategic Studies at the Marine Corps University in Quantico. His most recent book is Mastering the Art of Command, an analysis of Admiral Chester Nimitz's leadership during the Pacific Theater in World War II. He is also the author of Learning War, the Evolution of Fighting Doctrine in the U.S. Navy, 1898 to 1945, a work which I think is particularly relevant for our discussion today. In addition to these works, he has published numerous articles in journals such as the Naval War College Review and the Journal of Military History. His presentation will analyze how the U.S. Navy drew upon its pre-war doctrine and battlefield lessons to refine its combat and logistical capabilities during World War II. Trent will be followed by Frank Blazich. Frank Blazich is a curator of military history at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. Before that, he worked at the U.S. Navy Seabee Museum and received his PhD from The Ohio State University in 2013. I did say The Ohio State University. I went to Nebraska, so go Big Red. Frank is the author of An Honorable Place in American Air Power, Civil Air Patrol Coastal Patrol Operations 1942-1943, published in 2020 by Air University Press, as the editor of Bataan Survivor, a POW's account of Japanese captivity in World War II, published by the University of Missouri Press in 2017. His presentation today will explore how wartime experiences of two construction battalions illustrate the Navy's shifting policies around what role African-American sailors would play in World War II and the Navy at large. Ladies and gentlemen, Trent Hone and Frank Blazich.
is the click. This. Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Sean, for that delightful introduction, and thank you all for being here this morning. It's a pleasure to be back at the International Conference and as part of the World War II Museum's effort to ensure that we keep the war in our memories and that we understand it. I'm going to talk about 3 U.S. Navy systems today, systems that challenged pre-war assumptions about how the Navy would fight and how the Navy would win, and that forced a level of adaptation, as Sean alluded to. I'm going to start with the lowest of scales, individual ships, and then eventually zoom out to an entire theater. So we begin with the Combat Information Center, a new means of processing information aboard ships that was instrumental in ensuring that the U.S. Navy forces could operate effectively in combat. Now, many of you who are familiar with the history of the war, particularly its naval operations, will be aware that the U.S. Navy experimented with and was starting to integrate radar into its ships, its tactics, its force structure before the war. There was an assumption that radar would lift the veil of darkness and allow the fleet to operate more or less as it did in daytime. But this did not work out well. And nowhere was this more evident than in the fighting in and around the Solomon Islands in the fall of 1942. As the late James Hornfisher has described in his book, Neptune's Inferno, there were 5 major night surface actions fought off the waters around the island of Guadalcanal. Savo Island, Cape Esperance, first Guadalcanal, second Guadalcanal, and then the Battle of Tassafaronga. And in these battles, the U.S. Navy did not perform as well as it had anticipated, and radar was not used as effectively as it might have been. We can see here the results of some of this. This is the ship named after this city, the USS New Orleans. She was damaged by a salvo of torpedoes launched by the Japanese at the Battle of Tassafaronga. And I'm not going to assume that each of you are familiar with the layout of the ship, but in the bow, ahead of what you can see here, there was another turret. And there was more length of the bow, and it was shorn off by the impact of these Japanese torpedoes. A cruiser line, of which New Orleans was one, was disrupted by that salvo at the Battle of Tassafaronga. And one of the things that is interesting about these fights is that there is information that is available. Radar makes information available. It was possible to fight more effectively with that information. And as action reports come back to Admiral Nimitz and his staff at Pearl Harbor, he's the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet at the time, they discern that the information should be used more effectively, but it's not. Radar, rather than lifting the veil of darkness, is providing more information than can be processed aboard ship at the time. So ship captains and formation commanders are overwhelmed by the information that is coming to them. They can't make sense of it fast enough. But this is discerned. And so Nimitz, in November of 1942, when the fighting for Guadalcanal is at its height, issues a new tactical bulletin. And in essence, it's orders to the Pacific Fleet. The focus is Pacific Fleet radar doctrine, but its subtitle is establishing a combat information center. So essentially what he says is every ship needs to create one of these, a combat information center. It's going to take in information from all the various sources. It's going to analyze it, synthesize it, and then provide it in an actionable format to the ship's commanding officer and the ship's weapon systems. And what I think is very interesting about this bulletin is Nimitz explains what the CIC should accomplish, but he does not explain how. And what he's doing is he's triggering this broad base of parallel experimentation. This is something that the fleet had been habituated to in years before the war. So different ships start trying different things, start working out different approaches to establishing a combat information center. Now, from this distance, 80-some years removed, we may think to ourselves, well, isn't that inefficient? All these ships are going to try different things. Some of these things aren't going to work out. And in terms of the effort expended, it may have been less efficient than allowing some shore-based command to work out how best to organize a CIC. But Nimitz's greatest concern is time. How fast We need to work this out. We need to work this out as quickly as we can. And so a broad base of experimentation allows different approaches to organizing a CIC to be experimented with very quickly. And so ships begin to work things out, and officers, as they return back to port in the combat zone, share ideas. Hey, what did you try with your CIC? What worked? What didn't work? And they begin to learn quickly. And meanwhile, Nimitz and his staff harness the best approaches that are emerging based on action reports and promulgate new instructions in terms of how to do this. So it has an advantage of speed. It has another advantage. Different ships need different things from their combat information centers. Carriers have to be able to perform effective fighter direction to intercept incoming strikes. Battleships have guns that can range as far as radar can detect targets, so they have to be able to engage immediately. They need to integrate their CICs with their gunnery departments. And destroyers have to be able to track subsurface, surface, and aerial targets in order to address all of these threats. And so the solutions that emerge not only emerge quickly, they're very contextual. Different ships set up different standards for how to organize a combat information center. And so less than half a year later, you start to see the emergence of effective techniques. But really, it's about a year later, in November of 1943, where the CIC starts to really prove its effectiveness. And you see this, at least in the Solomons, in the fighting around Bougainville. And so there, in November 1943, there are two battles. One is fought at Empress Augusta Bay by Rear Admiral Aaron S. Merrill. And he uses a distributed formation, something that wouldn't have been possible a year before, uses combat information centers to maximize the effectiveness of his ships, sends his destroyers in to attack the Japanese, holds his cruisers at a distance to use their guns. It succeeds. It prevents a Japanese effort to disrupt the invasion force. But it really is at the end of that month when Captain Arleigh Burke, a future chief of naval operations, wins his decisive victory with Desron 23 at the Battle of Cape St. George. And you can see some of the things that he said about the combat information centers of his ships on this slide. At no time was there confusion or lack of knowledge. The battle went better than most drills. And at the end of the action, we could overlay the track charts of one ship over another. And so it has, the Combat Information Center has enabled radar to live up to its promise. Now, US ships can operate not exactly as they might in daylight, but much more effectively. And so from this moment on, late 1943, the Japanese are outclassed. And they're not only outclassed in night combat, they're also outclassed in the skies, because now the raids that they try to conduct against US carrier forces are beaten back by much more effective fighter direction procedures operationalized by combat information centers aboard the carriers. And we see the results of that off Rabaul in November 1943, at Philippine Sea in June 1944, and it continues. It drives them to introduce the kamikaze. So the Combat Information Center is a crucial system. Now, in the Atlantic, there's a need to develop a similar system, but oriented slightly differently and at a much higher level. This is a system for anti-submarine warfare to combat the German U-boats. And the answer here will be the 10th Fleet. You see, one of the challenges, and this has been alluded to by some of the prior panels, there's an intelligence war in the Atlantic. Gross Admiral Karl Donitz is using German submarines in a way that allows him to capitalize on intelligence information. Insight into British shipping codes and other information allows him to route his U-boats to interception points to try to make the most of the limited strength that he has to destroy Allied convoys. And in 1941, before the United States enters the war, the US Navy gains a false sense of security because there is sufficient insight into the German enigma by Poles and others, as we heard in the last panel, to be able to understand how Donitz is maneuvering his submarines and to route convoys around some of these interception points. But this is intelligence being used defensively, right, to route convoys away from danger. One of the things that Admiral King, the Navy's commander-in-chief, commander of the Atlantic Fleet during this early time, is interested in is hunting German submarines. How to take this intelligence information and use it offensively. This becomes much more difficult. One of the challenges that Admiral King faces early on in the war, after the United States enters it officially, is that he tries to leverage techniques like Admiral Nimitz did in the Pacific. That is, capitalize on the ability of US Navy officers to learn and to experiment. The problem is, in the Atlantic, it has the opposite effect. Because there isn't a sufficient constraint, Nimitz can channel his actions against victory in battles against the Japanese. There's a very quick feedback loop there. You can decide whether you've sunk a Japanese ship or not. Here, against the U-boats, it's quite different. The feedback loop is much more distant. It's hard to tell whether you've attacked a submarine. And so there's this proliferation of techniques, and many of them are poor. Different Atlantic commands try different things. King tries to constrain it. He starts to bring Atlantic commands together. Every 2 weeks, there's a conference in the Navy Department, starting in October 1942. They talk about techniques. They talk about technology. They talk about how best to combat the submarines. And this begins to integrate things more effectively. But to some degree, it is insufficient because shipping has become the major constraint on Allied fighting power. And the combined chiefs of staff, the US Joint Chiefs and the British chiefs, recognize this when they meet at Casablanca in January 1941. And they agree that, quote, the defeat of the U-boat must remain a first charge on the resources of the United Nations. King wants to figure out how to use intelligence information, how to develop better tactics, and how to fight offensively. And one of the things that he has in mind is a knowledge that the major Allied navies that are fighting in the Atlantic are going to take slightly different approaches because of their dispositions, their orientations, and the way in which they like to employ their forces. So rather than unified command, which is something that we typically hear about as being quite valuable in World War II, King seeks unified effort. And in a conference held in March 1943, he establishes the foundation for this. So he's going to allow the US Navy, the British Royal Navy, and the Royal Canadian Navy to employ different techniques and be responsible for different areas of the Atlantic. What he wants to do is unleash US naval forces to act offensively, to take the war to the U-boats, to use intelligence information. So he establishes an umbrella organization, a coordinating organization. That's the 10th Fleet. It's not a fleet like the Atlantic Fleet or the Pacific Fleet. It is a fleet that is designed to develop the best techniques, tactics, and employment of US naval forces to sink and destroy U-boats. King makes himself the 10th Fleet commander, and he puts Rear Admiral Francis Lowe as his chief of staff, a very talented operations officer. And they begin to employ US forces offensively. They build hunter-killer groups around escort carriers like Card, pictured here, and they route them using a plot of all the Atlantic and where the U-boats happen to be based on Enigma decrypts, signals intelligence, and other information to areas where they can intercept U-boats. And they target the supply U-boats because Donitz has introduced larger submarines that can refuel the smaller ones and keep them at sea for longer. And here, this is a pair of submarines. One of them, U-117, is one of those resupply U-boats, one of those so-called milk cows, and it's refueling U-66, and it is surprised by Card's aircraft in August 1943. And the attack is photographed. You can see one of the pictures here, and in some of them, you know, as in this frame, the submarines are so close together, you can see them both. The aircraft concentrate on U-117 and sink it. U-66 escapes. But the campaign against these resupply submarines is very successful because King and Lowe know this is a way to reduce the radius, reduce the effective fighting strength of the U-boats, attack their logistical lifeline. In the spring of 1943, Donitz had 10 of these submarines. By the end of October, he only has one left because hunter-killer groups like Cards and other efforts of the Allied navies have sunk all the rest of them. And then King and Lowe turn their attention to the rest of the German U-boats. And these hunter-killer groups are so effective that by the midpoint of 1944, roughly 60% of the German submarines that are being sunk by these groups, routed by the 10th Fleet. So the system here is one that allows intelligence to be used offensively. Not just route convoys around submarine concentrations, but identify the submarines, hunt them, kill them,
and thereby ensure the safety of convoys across the Atlantic. We asked some questions in the earlier panel. Where was intelligence used effectively? This is one excellent example. Finally, the last system, Pacific logistics. But the Pacific covers roughly half the world. And so being able to ensure that the material that is coming from the industrial capacity of the United States is where it is needed to be able to take the war to the Japanese and win quickly is crucial. And in the Pacific, according even to the Army's official history, joint logistics reaches its highest point. Those of you who have studied the Pacific War, particularly the US Navy's preparations for it before the war, the famous War Plan Orange, Orange being the code name for Imperial Japan, know that certainly by the late 1930s, the US Navy is planning a campaign in the Pacific, a sustained advance that will capture bases along the way and ultimately take the war to the shores of Japan. But consistently, if you look at the records, if you look at the preparation, there's an eye toward logistics, but they underestimate exactly what will be needed, the quantities of material, and how exactly to take it to where it's going to be needed in the Pacific. The US Navy plans an ability to package up advanced bases and ship them overseas. This is the Lion, that's the code name of large base, the Cub, logically, small base. And an Acorn, I'm not sure where they got that name, is an air base. The problem with this is, as they discover in the South Pacific, if you package up all the pieces for a base and ship it overseas, that's not how you build a base. You build a base incrementally. You need certain material at certain times. And so when you package up the whole thing and send it overseas, a lot of material sits and a lot of material rots in the South Pacific sun. So there needs to be a flow of material. There needs to be a more sophisticated approach to managing it and managing base construction. And one of the things that the Navy hits on is, we're very good at mobility. We're very good at sort of scrapping things together. But our colleagues in the Army, they have a more centralized planning approach. There might be some advantages if we marry these together. And one officer who realizes this very quickly, is Admiral William Halsey. He becomes commander of the South Pacific area in October 1942. And he understands that one of the challenges with winning at Guadalcanal is logistics. And so he has attended the Army War College. He knows about their capabilities. And he installs Brigadier General Raymond Williamson as the head of the port of Noumea on the island of New Caledonia. And this is a vital port, not just for Guadalcanal, but also for General MacArthur's Southwest Pacific area. And Williamson transforms the port using the Army's expertise at supply. 50,000 tons of material flows through that port in November 1942. Williamson increases that fourfold, 210,000 tons by January 1943. That's enough not just to ensure victory at Guadalcanal, that also creates the ability to use that island as a base for further advance toward Rabaul through the Solomons. So now you see a marriage of Army and Navy approaches, the best of both, emerging. Admiral Nimitz, for the Central Pacific Offensive, capitalizes on that. In September 1943, he establishes this new joint staff structure. It's preparation for the Central Pacific Offensive that will be unleashed in November of that year. And one of the things that he does is he takes an Army general, Edmund Levy, and makes him the J4, just there at the bottom below the text that I've inserted. So now you have an Army logistician who is in charge of the division that is responsible for the Central Pacific, or for the Pacific Ocean Areas Theater and the Pacific Ocean Areas Offensive. And what Levy does is he introduces a system of automatic supply, right? We're not going to package up big bases. We're going to send material when it's needed in anticipation of offensive operations, base construction, and all the like. And so this is an enabling capability that allows the offensive to move quickly. The other thing Nimitz has to do is he has to ensure mobility. He's getting pressure from the combined chiefs of staff. Extend unremitting pressure against Japan. Well, it's difficult because you've got to seize a base, at least this is an assumption. Truk in the Caroline Islands is targeted as a potential base. The Palau Islands is targeted as another potential base. But the Japanese have fortified these areas. And so trying to seize them and fight for them is going to bog the offensive down. It risks culminating the effort. Nimitz cannot afford to do that, so he has to ensure mobility. What's the way to ensure mobility? Well, the automatic supply is one. The other is, well, let's keep the base afloat. And so Service Squadron 10, a mobile fleet base, is created. And this initially operates from the Marshall Islands at Majuro Atoll. It moves to Eniwetok later, and then finally to Ulithi, the famous atoll beyond those. And the headquarters eventually moves to Leyte in early 1945, Leyte Gulf. But these ships serve as a mobile base to resupply the fleet, to repair the fleet, to ensure that it can continue to mount this pressure upon Japan. But it's not enough, because the offensive still moves in pulses. The carriers have to come back, they have to replenish before the next strike. What is necessary is an ability to keep the fleet resupplied and fighting under the umbrella of Japanese aerial attack, under the edge of the Japanese home islands. So Service Squadron 6, a mobile replenishment organization, is created in December 1944. It's going to integrate with the fleet, bring material and supplies to it, keep the fleet fighting. It's tested with Operation Detachment, which captures Iwo Jima, but it is really in Operation Iceberg, the capture of Okinawa, where this formation comes into its own. And so, starting in March 1945 and continuing for 2.5 months, the carrier forces operate within 350 miles of Kyushu, protecting the assault on Okinawa, but also harassing the Japanese home islands. The carrier groups themselves spend 47, 62, and 77 days at sea. Service Squadron 6 brings 8.7 million barrels of fuel oil, over 21 million gallons of gasoline, and all kinds of other material. And this is what allows the fleet to come to Okinawa and stay. And it's what's going to allow the fleet to continue to harass Japan until the surrender occurs. So each of these systems is itself the product of another system. And that was the ability that the Navy introduced before the war, to learn systematically, to condition officers to deal with challenges, to experiment with creative approaches, and to devise new tactics, techniques, and doctrines for dealing with those things that they faced. And one of the things that I try to impress upon audiences is that, yes, adaptation is going to happen in wartime. It's crucial to be able to do that. But if you do not build the muscle memory, or the mental memory, as it were, to do those kinds of things, to experiment, to explore before the war, learning in the wartime itself can put you at a disadvantage. You need to capitalize on routines, habits that have been inculcated beforehand. That, I think, is one of the major lessons when we look at the US Navy and its operations and its learning in World War II. I thank you for your time and attention. And I look forward to your questions.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I thank you all for attending this panel, and I thank you for the opportunity to speak here today on something that's a wee bit different than what Trent just spoke about. Okay, there we go. Now, the United States Navy had limited organizational culture with black sailors in the first decades of the 20th century, and it had zero experience working with large numbers of black sailors. In fact, from 1913 to 1940, black representation in the ranks varied from 1.2 to 2.3% of the total enlisted strength, and almost all of these black personnel served in the messman branch, which had uniforms and insignia different from other enlisted sailors to emphasize their lower caste. Messmen were often referred to as seaborne bellhops. But with global war and an election year in 1940, the black press, influential black voices, and organizations like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, increased demands on President Roosevelt for increased opportunities for blacks to serve in the armed forces. In the summer of 1941, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, seen here, established a four-man committee to investigate if the Naval Service enlisted personnel adequately represented the nation. Hint, they didn't. The majority report concluded that enlisting blacks for anything other than mess attendants, quote, leads to disruptive and undermining conditions. Whereas the minority report argued that, quote, a man's right to fight for his country is probably more fundamental than his right to vote. Roosevelt endorsed the minority report, and Knox asked the General Board to provide a plan for placing 5,000 blacks in non-messman billets. Now, concurrent with this new development, there was a new organization within the Bureau of Yards and Docks, or BUDOCS, which also took form. In late December 1941, Rear Admiral Ben Morrell, seen here, Chief of BUDOCS, wrote to the Bureau of Navigation stating the need for military construction forces of uniformed personnel under direct military command for advanced base construction in combat zones, as Trent just discussed, and these would be organized into self-sufficient battalions commanded by Civil Engineer Corps officers. Now, early on, Morrell saw no reason whatsoever not to accept black personnel. Quite frankly, the demand for skilled workers outweighed any issue about race. Now, addressing Knox's request, the Navy's General Board thought of nothing and concluded black men could only serve in the messman branch. Roosevelt, unsurprisingly, went, guess again, and sent it back to the General Board. The issue then passed to the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Harold Stark, who suggested we have these new construction battalions. Black personnel could serve in those, they could serve in shore stations for general labor purposes, or perhaps they could man yard craft. And on April 7th, as we can see in our press release, the Navy Department announced that black volunteers would be accepted for general service in the reserve components of the Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard. In less than 2 weeks after this announcement, Morrell outlined BUDOCS's plan for Black Seabees. He intended to establish one or more battalions if sufficient volunteers could be obtained. He also said all the leadership for these black construction battalions, the commissioned and warrant officers, the chief, and the first-class petty officers, would be white. Without any experience training or commanding large groups of uniformed black personnel, BUDOCS said, we'll reach out to the Army. They have such a happy experience with black Americans. And they asked for guidance, and you can see the summation of this exact guidance here on the slide. Think of this as gentlemen's agreement. The Army said, treat this as confidential, never share this, don't let anyone see this. But this guidance would govern the personnel policies for the first two black construction battalions with racial friction and conflict all but preordained certainties. Now, the first of these battalions, the 34th Naval Construction Battalion, organized in September 1942 with over 1,000 black volunteer recruits, which included 52 college graduates or men with college education. This, quite frankly, is the largest assemblage of black sailors in the entire history of the United States Navy up to this time. Now, BUDOCS, as I said, will place white officers and white petty officers in charge, predominantly from southern states because, quote, they knew how to handle black Americans. The battalion commander imposed segregation, and he enforced Jim Crow policies. I have a choice quote from him here on the slide. The Black Seabees, in turn, reached out to the NAACP about this situation, and they requested an investigation. But nothing was able to happen prior to this battalion shipping out to the Pacific in January of 1943, at which point the 2nd Battalion, the 80th, would form later that month. Likewise, all the officers and chief petty officers were white and predominantly Southern born. Now, after completing its training, it transferred to Advanced Base Depot, Gulfport, Mississippi, prior to assignment outside of the continental United States. The racial tensions in the deeply Jim Crow community, together with the Navy unit segregation, proved unbearable for these Seabees. Again, they contacted the NAACP, specifically the New Orleans branch of the NAACP, requesting an investigation. And the Navy investigated itself and went, we're fine, no problem here. And nothing then happened until this unit shipped out in mid-July for the Caribbean. But in terms of actual field results, by mid-1943, we have to remember the 34th had now been operating in the Florida, Russell, and Solomon Islands for months. They had taken enemy fire, they had taken casualties, they had worked side by side with white construction battalions, particularly preparing airfields for the new Georgia campaign. And this structure of white leadership and segregated personnel, on the surface, in written reports back in Washington, seemed to be working. Now let's add another dimension here. In February of 1943, blacks only represented 2% of the Navy's total enlisted force versus 10% of the national demographic. And this became an issue, particularly for the United States Army, who said, well, how come the Navy's not carrying their load of enlistees? So to address this, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9279 in late December of 42. This would terminate all voluntary enlistment in the armed forces for the duration of the war. Selective service via the War Manpower Commission thereafter became the source to obtain personnel for the needs of the armed forces. Now the Navy, having to take more black sailors, said we don't want to resort to mixed crews, so they said, well, let's increase the construction battalions. We'll add 3 more regular naval construction battalions of black personnel, and we'll even take non-rated black personnel and we'll put them into 24 new white construction battalions. And this plan was taking advantage of a new Seabee development, what was known as the Special Naval Construction Battalion. The Seabee Specials were actually stevedore units, authorized in fall of 1942 to address the challenges of unloading cargo ships expeditiously in operational areas. I defer back to Trent's talk. Beginning in July of 43 and continuing until the end of the year, there would be 7 of these Black Seabee Specials commissioned. But what about the 3 construction battalions? The Navy did attempt to organize them, but they couldn't find sufficient personnel and decided to break them up and push all the personnel into Seabee Specials. Also, I hope everyone appreciates the beauty of containerized shipment, because back in the day, if you notice, you have to hand fill all the individual boxes onto your pallet, sling your pallet out, then unpack that pallet, load it onto trucks, and move the supplies. Logistics are our friend. Meanwhile, the 80th has found itself in Trinidad by August of 43, and their focus is building this massive steel lighter-than-air hangar for Navy blimper operations there in the Caribbean. In their camp, which was isolated from the white units on the island, racial discrimination ruled the day and impacted the construction progress. There was increasing racial tension between the white and black Seabees. In September, the battalion commander said, geez, I need to solve this problem, so he invited the, quote, best educated, i.e. the college graduates or college-educated Black Seabees, to meet with him for a simple off-the-record conversation. It was a very frank conversation, but the Black Seabees who attended thought maybe we've turned a corner here. But within a week of this meeting, 19 men found themselves deemed attempted mutineers, among other charges. And by the end of October, they were back in the United States with undesirable unfitness discharges, having never received a hearing, a court-martial, or any sentencing whatsoever. The Army racial policies for these first 2 battalions, quite frankly, were problematic. And some in the Navy did recognize the faults. The Navy is learning. I defer back to Trent. That same October, the 5th Naval District convened a confidential conference to address matters relative to black personnel in the district. And the commander of the training camps for all the Black Seabee battalions, Captain John G. Ware, seen here on the slide, spoke rather candidly and essentially is saying, look, the Army policies didn't work and we've discarded them. Long story short, unsurprisingly, then and now, preconceived notions about black personnel were harmful. If you treat individuals with respect, respect invites respect, and you have harmonious, effective military units. And by late 1943, the Navy is now also contending with this need to bring on more black personnel while facing the repercussions of its own race policies. The news of these discharges of the 19 Seabees are now nationwide news, particularly in the black press, and Black America has a uniformly negative view of the United States Navy. Knox and the Navy leadership are not helping the situation. After the discharges, the men actually promptly went to the NAACP offices in Washington to report their story. The NAACP then turned to the Navy and said, we want details. What happened here? Knox said, well, the commander and the battalion, all this again is based on hearsay. The battalion says, I threw the men out and the battalion's operating better, so the ends justify the means. The Navy's not going to change the situation. But this matter does not go away, largely because of the Seabees themselves, especially Isaac McNatt, as we can see here, publishes an article in the summer of 44, I was a Seabee. This gets serialized and picked up nationwide, and it keeps this incident in the views of the American public. As 1944 progresses, we'll see 7 more of these Black Seabee construction battalions come online and ship out to the Pacific. Meanwhile, the 80th had completed its work in Trinidad in May, and by June they're in Port Hueneme, California. What about the 34th? Their commander refused to give them any R&R, so they continued to operate in the South Pacific. After 21 consecutive months, they returned home in October 44, and now essentially were ineffective as a unit due to personnel losses, either from malaria or other tropical conditions. But that same year, the Navy does begin substantial shifts on racial personnel policy. In May of '44, James Forrestal will become Secretary of the Navy after the sudden death of Frank Knox. Forrestal is not a racial crusader, but he does believe, in terms of efficiency and fairness, black sailors deserve equal opportunities with those of whites. He will use his position as Secretary to act on internal Navy guidance, and he'll use this to actively experiment with the Navy's policies. We'll start to see black sailors in small numbers integrate into ships at sea. Men and women will receive commissions, and he'll slowly move the service towards full integration. In both May and July of '44, the first two black Civil Engineer Corps officers, Edwin Swain Hope and Joseph Banks Williams, will commission and find service with Seabee units. I should note for Hope, he is commissioned outright as a lieutenant, not as an ensign, so the Seabees have the highest ranking black officer in the entire Navy. Now, through a blend of Forrestal's shifts on racial issues, as well as increased awareness of racism's corrosive effects on unit cohesion, changes will materialize for the first two black battalions. After an internal Budox investigation of the ADF's command climate, they will reorganize. They will receive all new white officers, 60 new volunteer white chief petty officers who specifically volunteered for this assignment, and changes will be dramatic in the morale and the output of this battalion. That same summer, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, better known, as we can see, as the GI Bill of Rights, will become law. And within this legislation is authorization for the Secretaries of the War and the Navy to establish review boards able to change, correct, or modify any discharge or dismissal. And this will provide an opening to try and bring some justice to the 19 discharged Seabees. By August, the NAACP, with its special counsel, Thurgood Marshall, will join legal forces with the CIO's National War Relief Committee, as well as the American Civil Liberties Union, to obtain a joint hearing before the Navy's new Board of Review, Discharges, and Dismissals to examine the cases of the men of the ADF Construction Battalion. Now, I should note that established and trained under more enlightened racial policies, the Black Seabee Specials are going to demonstrate the future of the naval service. On the morning of 15 September 1944, 777 Black Seabees of the 17th Special Naval Construction Battalion land on the island of Peleliu 2 hours after the 1st Marine Division come ashore. The ferocity of the fighting that first day left the Marines asking the Seabees that evening for volunteers for combat. At least 200 of these men immediately joined up. Others hauled mounds of ammunition to the front line, so much the Marines went, "Stop, we're good, we have enough." They'll carry back wounded Marines. They'll also take over manning anti-tank guns to free up white Marines for operations, and by many accounts, many white Marine accounts, many of these Seabees fight as infantry, side by side with white Marines, until the Japanese airfield is secured. And this will earn very high praise in white press from the white Marine Corps leadership. Back in Washington, on December 11, '44, the Navy Review Board will convene to hear the petitions of actually 15 of the 19 discharged men. Arthur Garfield Hayes, Sr., who's the co-founder of the ACLU, will speak as the collective representative for the Seabees attorneys. The black and the white press will attend these hearings. It will be covered nationwide. And Hayes and the other attorneys, in their closing statements, you can see some of them here, really make an emphasis to say, look, this is not about race so much as injustice. And injustice that any person, white, black, northern, southern, would take umbrage with. What's happening on the other side of the country? Well, back in Port Hueneme, you have the 34th and the 80th. The 80th has new leadership. Their morale is improved. But the 34th, worn out after 21 months in the Pacific, are still languishing under the same uninformed racist leadership. We start to see this river, really a flood, probably shouldn't say that in New Orleans, of correspondence inundate the offices of the NAACP in New York City, calling for an investigation. The Navy again says, okay, we'll investigate ourselves. Yeah, we're fine here, no problem. Tired of this same playbook, the NAACP launches its own investigation. And they find that the Black Seabees are correct in their claims of discriminatory practices and unfair treatment. The NAACP investigators say this unit is on the brink of mutiny. And since the news headlines are here, it gives it away. In 2 days at the start of March of '45, approximately 1,000 men will voluntarily conduct a hunger strike lasting 2 days in protest to the battalion's racial policies. This strike will make headlines coast to coast, and it brings numerous inquiries from Congress to the doorstep of Morell and Forrestal. By the end of March, the Navy Inspector General has examined the situation and confirmed, yes, we have segregation here, promotions are being denied, there's extremely low morale in the battalion. The men of the 34th will soon receive new leadership, new chief petty officers, and by mid-April, the Navy sends them back out to the Pacific, particularly to Okinawa, as a reborn unit. At the beginning of that same April, it'll be announced that Forrestal has approved the decision to upgrade the discharges of all but one of the men discharged from the 80th back in September of '43. Why does this matter? These men can now access the GI Bill of Rights benefits. It will also bring belated justice, and the black press does take notice of this. By mid-May, the 80th will now ship out for the Philippines. So by summer of 1945, we have 14,237 Black Seabees in uniform, just over 4,000 regular units, and about 10,000 in the specials. It's 5.8% of all the Seabees then in service, which is slightly higher than the percentage of blacks in the US Navy overall. The black press is now publishing increasingly positive stories about the Navy. Black Seabees are finally achieving the highest ranks of Chief Petty Officer, as well as Petty Officer First Class. They're assuming leadership positions previously held by whites. The Navy also is experiencing increasing integration in 1945, and it's the Seabee Specials leading the way. As the war ends in the Pacific, the Black Seabee Specials are often taking in white personnel, as other men, because of the point system or their units, are rotating home. What you then have, as you can see here, are black and white Seabees living together, eating together, working together as professional equals in uniform. Several of these battalions are almost exactly 50-50 black and white personnel. Post-war, the Seabees will dramatically downsize, along with the rest of the armed forces. By August 1st of '46, you only have 139 Black Seabees still on active duty. These men return to civilian life. Their individual wartime contributions fade from memory. I doubt you'll find a single one of these photos anywhere in this whole hotel, for example. But their collective service in this new naval organization is a critical catalyst in overturning decades of racial policy and misconceptions in the United States Navy. These Black Seabees not only help forge the enduring Seabee culture of can-do, but they also teach the Navy that racially based personnel policies could make, or just as well break, an effective unit. Furthermore, as we all know, quality leaders are essential to success, whether of a construction battalion or of a warship. Quality leaders ensure sailors are rated on their skills and ingenuity, rather than on the color of their skin. These lessons learned will aid the Navy in the forthcoming overall desegregation of the armed forces, but particularly in recruiting and retaining personnel for the growing threats in the Cold War. Thank you all very much.
Well, thank you so much, gentlemen, for two fantastic and fascinating presentations. I'm going to give you guys each sort of one individual question and then throw some sort of big picture overarching questions for you to talk about, and then we'll throw it open to the audience. But to start, Frank, I wanted to ask about something you made, a point you made at the very end about the coming sort of overall integration of the armed forces. Do you think that the Navy's experience in World War II made that process of integration easier than it did for other military services? Did the Navy's experience here sort of smooth that transition process and make it more better than the Army, maybe?
I would argue it absolutely smoothed the process, and Forrestal is a key component, but to tie into this, which I think Trent will back up, Forrestal could have the vision, but he needed the Navy's uniformed leaders to support him. He was able to get Admiral King to join him in this, and because King supported him, King was able to influence the other uniformed leaders and say, back the secretary. It probably doesn't hurt that Forrestal also becomes Secretary of Defense, at least for the initial chaos of that process. And so Forrestal has positioned the Navy that they realize, yes, we can be professionals here, we want the best people, and we're able to move, we're gonna smooth this process. This isn't to say that we don't see problems, particularly the Vietnam War, with racial issues in the United States Navy, but we're not gonna see nearly the same problems that the Army or the Marine Corps will somewhat experience with the desegregation process in the late 1940s.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you.
And Trent, I'm wondering, especially given your current position and some of the processes you talked about in your presentation, what's the role of education, specifically professional military education, in sort of preparing the Navy and sort of putting these Navy officers in the circumstances where they can adapt to these changes?
Oh, I think it's extremely important. So the Navy revised its professional education system in the interwar period. It starts, or the seeds for that are laying in the immediate aftermath of World War I. There is an influential report comes out that King is part of as a younger officer. It's called the Knox-Pye-King report. So Knox is Dudley Knox. Pye is William Pye. He was the interim commander of the Pacific Fleet in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, and then, of course, King. And they recommend that an officer's career should be divided into 4 major stages, and each one of those should have an educational component. So the Naval Academy, and then there should be a line officer's course, which familiarizes officers and prepares them for command. There should be a junior war college course, which gets them to think about how to analyze situations and begin to impart doctrine, and then a senior war college course, which prepares them for high command. And eventually, all those are introduced before World War II. And when William Pratt is the Chief of Naval Operations in the early 1930s, he establishes a precedent requirement that you have to go to the War College in order to be a flag officer, in order to be an admiral. It's not just the Naval War College, which is why Halsey's able to go to the Army War College. But that, I mean, when you talk to naval officers today about that, because there's a significantly lower percentage of flag officers that have been to the Naval War College now. I think at the time of Pearl Harbor, there was 1 flag officer who hadn't been through one of the war colleges. So education is instrumental, and they are intentionally using it as an indoctrination mechanism. Like, you will think this way, you will think about these kinds of things, and it's not a constraining indoctrination so much as it is you need to be able to encourage subordinates to employ their initiative and their creativity. You need to know how to do that, and how you frame orders, how you frame instructions. Those are all part of that. And that's what the War College would teach officers to do.
Thank you, Trent. That's fascinating. Two big questions that I'd love for you to both sort of think about and chew on. One of them is that you've both outlined different sort of mechanisms of change. But to what extent are the changes that you both observed top-down, and to what extent are they bottom-up? That's the first question. And the second one has to do with a theme I think that came up a lot yesterday, and it's come up again today, which is this idea of individual agency. We've heard a lot about individuals. You both mentioned specific individuals playing important roles in these. But I wonder if we could talk a little bit about bureaucracy. Certainly, individuals have agency in history, but how important is bureaucracy in the histories that you both have studied?
Okay, I'll go first. I'll touch upon agency first. What's really amazing, the NAACP papers in the Library of Congress have a wealth of personal letters from Seabees to the NAACP outlining the situation. And as I emphasize the issue in college education with a lot of these men, because had they been white, with their degrees, they would have had commissions. They likely would have been chief petty officers. They likely would have been petty officers first class, not petty officer second class, or seaman second class, things like that. They would have had higher positions. Hence a source of resentment with the racial conflict. They use their education to build grassroots support with the NAACP, with their local communities. They'd often identify who were the civil rights leaders in a community, and they'd begin a dialogue. And this is where ideas begin to come from. An idea of a hunger strike, for example, a nonviolent action where they refused to eat, but they didn't refuse to work, to find a gray area in the Navy rules so that they couldn't be charged. And so it avoided mass conflict by doing it this way. So there's a great degree of agency from the Seabees themselves and their communities with then larger either branch or national organizations to apply pressure then on the top level of the United States Navy, particularly people like Secretary Knox, Secretary Forrestal, Admiral Morrell, as well as Admiral King. That pressure, and you again can see the correspondence, they're the ones, even though you have lower tiers saying, charge these men, court-martial, and they go, nope, nope, we're not going to make a scene out of this. it's clearly they've learned, they realize, aha, we are at fault, but instead of openly saying the Navy's at fault, we're just going to let the issue go down. We're going to lower the temperature, so to speak. The strike leaders for the hunger strike were removed from the brig, transferred out of the battalion, left at Port Hueneme. They were all given honorable discharges. 3 came back and served during the Korean War, in fact. So a very different attitude than, say, the Port Chicago mutiny, when we look at like the massive the massive court-martial, as well as discharges and jail sentences for a lot of these men. The Navy takes a different approach, and from the media perspective in particular, the Navy will emerge from this slightly better in 45 than what they emerge in 44. But the other group that really, people always ask you, what about the civil rights movement? What about the impact of the civil rights movement? Not many of these individual Black Seabees necessarily become prominent civil rights leaders, but for an organization like the NAACP, they have also learned, and they've figured out a method to work with bureaucracies, figure out the grassroots movements, develop agencies, the need for planning, and they will put this to great effect, of course, into the 1950s and 1960s. I think that answers it all. And on to Trent.
Thank you, Frank.
Yes. I am so pleased that you have used the word bureaucracy. I bristled a little bit in the prior panel. In a discussion about German intelligence, we heard that the Nazi regime was very bureaucratic, right? So it's just shorthand for inefficiency, and we all expect that. But I think if we look back, not just 80 years, 100 years, at the United States and the U.S. Navy particularly, there is a sense that bureaucracy, that is how we organize to execute, how we organize to get things done, can be an advantage if we do it the right way, right? Because if you organize individuals, and those of us who have experienced an effective organization understand this, whether we call it bureaucratic, military, or something else, right? You can organize people to get amazing things done through that organization, much greater power than any given individual, or amplify the powers of individuals. And so, the secretaries of the Navy and many senior naval officers recognize this. And one of the things that they are attuned to is how to use bureaucracy, how to use organization to not just get big things done, but also maximize the potential of the individuals within it. And so, you've sort of done an interesting thing with your question in that you've juxtaposed these things, individual bureaucracy, top down, bottom up. And the answer that I would give is the U.S. Navy doesn't see these things as contrast. They see these things as if you meld them together, if you organize the right way, they work and they amplify each other. So when it comes to top down versus bottom up, what do you have? Well, you have a top down policy that gives direction, orientation. What do we want to do? Well, in the Atlantic, we want to kill U-boats. How do you do that? You set up an organization that then allows the individuals within it to maximize their independence and flexibility and creativity toward that end. You can unleash the competency of an individual with the right kind of bureaucratic organization. And the Navy tries time and again to do this. In my book on Nimitz, this is something that I try to illustrate, is he's adapting his organizational structures, his command hierarchy, his staff organization, and all these other things in order to be more effective. And it repeatedly does it throughout the war. You have to shed the things that aren't effective about a bureaucracy to keep it honed, to keep it effective, and allow the right balance of top down and bottom up.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, gentlemen. I believe Connie and Jeremy are out there with the microphones.
A round of applause for Sean, Trent, and Frank. Great job, guys. We'll start all the way in the back right corner with me, please, gents.
I believe you mentioned the Korean War, though. So there was a segregated unit that fought in the Korean War, the 24th, and you mentioned how the Navy did much better in the Korean War than the Army. That unit was pretty controversial. I know Clay Burrell, in his account, basically just throws his hands up and goes, I'm not quite sure how the unit did because there's so much contradiction in sources.
That is correct. I'm not aware at that point that the Navy's having segregated units, certainly not Seabee battalions, but the Seabees shrank so far after the Second World War that when the Korean War comes around, it's, quick, we need the Seabees. What? because they just don't have them. So they're having to resurrect a lot of these units. I haven't necessarily studied what percentage of Black Seabees were in the units at that time, but what I do know is the issues that we saw with the 80th and the 34th, they're gone. I mean, they just don't have that at that point. Also, from the Korean War perspective, one could think of figures such as the commander of the 92nd Infantry Division, Major Ned Almond. If we have any Marines here who know of the Chosin Reservoir incident and what happened there, General Almond's racial policies never really evolved pre-war, during the war, and certainly not post-war. The Navy, on the other hand, very much issued guidance, particularly for officers, and they realized, too, that you had to educate enlisted personnel to essentially say, look, you may have grown up with all these misconceptions. They're just that. They're misconceptions. They're not true. And instead, this is what is true. And by educating people and explaining differences, so to speak, or perhaps different cultural aspects, the Navy found that this eliminates, or if not eliminates, at least greatly attenuates and reduces the number of racial problems that they would have in units, particularly among individual personnel. That's a really wordy, long answer, and I do apologize.
Great. Next question is going to be in the center aisle, straight ahead.
Did Eleanor Roosevelt play any role in having the president accept the Minority Report?
I haven't found any evidence that that is the case. Curiously enough, she did visit the 80th Construction Battalion on Trinidad. That's the one piece of evidence that I found the connection directly with First Lady Roosevelt and the Seabees, so much so the Seabees wrote her, actually, in the summer of '44 when they were back home saying, basically, please God, help us with the situation that we face. From what I can tell, it was President Roosevelt directly when the General Board came back to him and said, we can't do anything. They can only be messmen. God forbid, we have black sailors and anything other than messmen or the world will disintegrate. Roosevelt, to his credit, he usually would write these very short memos, like, see me, or come talk to me, or I want to discuss this. He actually wrote a long memo back to the General Board, outlining all the areas they were wrong and then apologizing, sorry, your commander-in-chief wrote you a really long memo. But what he emphasized to that is you guys mean the General Board admirals, you mentioned politics. He said, that's not your job. I'm the politician. Politics is my realm. So let me handle the politics, and you all need to look at this objectively and say, where can we put the best talent in the armed forces? The best probably emphasis I would say of Eleanor Roosevelt is with the Tuskegee Airmen, for example, of getting black aviators into the armed forces. But as far as with the Seabees story, I've never found any evidence of Eleanor Roosevelt really directly influencing the president or Admiral Morrell, for that example, to get Black Seabees in.
Next question's with Connie, to your left, please.
Fantastic presentation. At what point from ship design, or is actually spaces start getting dedicated? Like, the New Orleans is a pre-war cruiser. At what point do they say, well, we need a room here to put all the equipment? When does that kind of evolve?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, it starts happening really in 1943. They start trying to figure out where do these things actually have to fit. And there's some question of, where's the best place to put it. Reading through action reports is quite fascinating because, some of the ships that don't have a combat information center will set it up near the bridge, and then there's an easy and effective exchange of information between the commanding officer of the ship and the combat information center. Others put it below decks, and there is actually an incident during the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay where destroyer commanding officer has to go down to the CIC to understand what's going on, loses track of the action, and it causes that destroyer to not perform quite as well. So it starts finding its way into ship design in 1943. But even later in the war, ships that have already been built, you see sort of different approaches to where is that CIC going to be set up, how is it going to be organized, et cetera. So there's a continuing evolution. But by the ship designs that are being sort of made by mid to late 43, it's part of it's just part of the process. But an excellent question.
Gentleman to your right, please.
This was the panel I was most excited about because I I find it incredibly moving hearing about men who were repeatedly told they were not welcome and their Americanness was questioned, who persist in serving and loving their country anyway. So thank you for this. I had two kind of related questions. Were any of the 146 Seabees in 1946 who were left, were any of them able to make a post-war career in the Navy? And then the second question is, you brought attention to Isaac McNall, I think is how I say his name.
McNabb, yeah.
McNabb. Are there any other specific individuals that you learned about in your research, the specific individual Seabees that you'd like to speak more about?
Thank you for the questions. I'll be honest, I don't know the names of who the 139 Black Seabees were who were still serving post-1946. That's a story that I, quite frankly, need to look into. But one of the most prominent names that I've come across is Roscoe Carroll Conklin. He was a mailman first class in the 34th Naval Construction Battalion, but before the war, he was the NAACP branch head for Atlantic City. So he's probably the senior-most NAACP member to join the Navy in World War II. What's astounding about this is Carroll was friends with Walter White, who was executive director of the NAACP. And Carroll kept up a correspondence with White during the war, at least when he could, because we have to remember, when the units go overseas, the mail is censored. They can't send back any information about the racial issues. So when the unit does come back in 1944, late 44, Carroll goes back, they're given leave, liberty, and Carroll goes back to Atlantic City. And while he's there, he goes to a talk where White's giving a presentation, they reconnect. What ends up happening is Carroll is actually brought to James Forrestal's office and meets with 4 of Forrestal's staff for a very off-the-record conversation, explicitly to detail what has been happening in the battalion and the racial policies. Now, maybe other folks here know different stories, but it's probably very unusual for a junior sailor to be given the audience to meet with the Secretary of the Navy's direct staff off the record for several hours. And why do I know this? Because Walter White kept a memo on it that's got all these asterisks saying, strictly confidential, do not publish, do not disclose, nobody knows about this. But that was the degree, too, when we think about bureaucracy and networks and how 1 or 2 individuals can really shift the Navy's perception. And most of all, Forrestal was willing to listen. He was willing to act. There's a war going on. We need the best people we can get. We need the best men, the best women. We need the talent. That's no different today as it was then to win the conflict. And I think that mindset, that willingness to shift, that willingness to adapt, to learn, as Trent has written and published, and buy Trent's book if it's for sale outside. That was a good plug. I thought you'd like that. This is really important. We can't not emphasize that enough. As much as we like to talk about the senior-most players, often it's the middle managers or it's some of the junior ranks who, through their pre-war experiences or connections, are able to really implement change. And they're, quite frankly, some of the best stories to be found. And Carroll's is one that I'm very grateful to have come across. And he was a very good letter writer. So I'm grateful that they survive to be able to use today.
Next question is going to be all the way to your left with Connie towards the back.
This question is for Trent. I know the U.S. Army Air Corps used operational research for target selection. Did the Navy use operational research? And if yes, can you explain operational research to people who don't really get what operational research is?
I will try. Yes, they made extensive use, particularly in the Atlantic, of operational research. It finds its way into the Pacific later. In the Navy's experience, it starts out in Boston. There is a command there that is investigating how best to combat German submarines. And they hit on the fact that there are some scientists who can use different theories about what's the best way to patrol around a convoy to maximize your chances with an aircraft, to maximize your chances of sighting an enemy submarine. What is the best pattern of depth charges to drop? What are the best ways to use different weapons? And initially there is some hesitation with this. So what operational research is basically getting people who have expertise in these different areas, scientists, not military officers, and getting them close to the details of how these attacks or other forms of military operation are being conducted so that they can use their scientific background and skill to understand how to maximize the efficiency of these fighting forces. And so the Boston organization starts this. Admiral King, after he becomes commander-in-chief, brings the head of that Boston organization, the military officer, the Navy officer, into the ComEng headquarters that he's established in Washington. And that officer, can't remember his name at the moment, basically begins to say, look, we got these scientists partnering with us. They were doing a very good job. We should bring them to Washington as well and start integrating them with the commands that are fighting against the U-boats. So there has to be some convincing, because King initially and some other naval officers are like, what do these civilian scientists know about Navy stuff? Turns out they know a great deal. So they do this. One of the things that makes it work is the scientists have to, these people who are engaged in the operations research, have to approach the naval commands with a certain amount of humility. They find out that the ones who show up and are kind of like, I know this scientific stuff, you Navy guys aren't doing this with enough discipline, you aren't doing it methodically, I know better. Anytime a scientist tries that, it doesn't work. Obviously, it raises the hackles of the naval officers, but they find officers who have a little bit more of a modest or diplomatic approach, are willing to integrate themselves with these operations, are willing to go on some of these flights, and there is a synergy that develops, and they become very effective. And eventually, it starts to spread to the Pacific as well. The anti-submarine techniques that are used in the Atlantic find their way there. And it has a significant impact on the ability to destroy Japanese submarines. So operational research is a key aspect. At the time that I had, I didn't think I had a lot of opportunity to talk about that, but thank you for raising the question, because that's extremely important. I hope I've done a good enough job of explaining very succinctly what operations research is.
We have time for one last quick question.
Well, I don't know if this one's going to be quick or not. It's up to you. You had a great story about the evolution of systems in the surface Navy and the carrier force. How did that apply to the submarine force? And separately, what did the Japanese Navy do in their evolution during the war also? Thanks.
Yeah, that's not quick, and I see, there's 48 seconds ticking here. So I'll start with the Japanese. I wish I knew more about this because there is, I think, an unfortunate, I'll call it a bias that may be too harsh, in the existing English language historiography. Unfortunately, I do not speak Japanese, that the Japanese did not learn as effectively or as rapidly. And I think that there are challenges with how the Japanese, both the Imperial Army and the Imperial Navy, learn, but they do learn. It's very clear that they do. They try different tactics, different techniques, and I see the shift to kamikaze tactics as a natural and logical response to the increasing sophistication of U.S. task force air defense systems. Right? You can't attack in mass anymore. It'll be intercepted. It'll be broken up. But if you attack with a series of small units or individual aircraft approaching from multiple vectors, the Japanese work out that can overwhelm an air defense system, the existing one that the U.S. Navy employs. So they are learning. It's learning in a slightly different way. I think it's channelized differently. But I think that would be a fascinating story to develop more. You asked about submarines. I'll try to do that justice in the few seconds that remain. Certainly there is an increasing system of sophistication with U.S. submarine tactics doctrine. One of the challenges that the U.S. submarine force has is that before the war there's an assumption that unrestricted submarine warfare is, well, I mean, it's not an assumption, it's illegal. So the U.S. submarine captains don't practice for it. And when it comes time to actually implement it, many of them have been trained in tactics that are unsuitable. They're used to attacking naval formations that are going to be well screened. And so they attack from submerged positions using sonar and other things. And that's not the best way to attack an unscreened Japanese convoy or merchant ship. So captains have to shift their tactics and techniques. They're also crippled by a terrible exploder. Frank's museum actually has a Mark VI exploder. It's a fascinating device. It does not work well. We all know that, or at least I assume most of us know that. So the tactics have to change. The weaponry has to change. And also there does need to become a new system of, how do we employ these submarines, route them to areas where they can create maximum damage to Japanese shipping, and it becomes increasingly sophisticated over the course of the war. There was an excellent article written by Rich Frank, who I see in the audience here not so long ago, about the number of Japanese soldiers that were killed by US submarines. And it's an enormous number because they're troop ships. They're trying to put different forces on different islands to stem the tide of the advances in the Central and the Southwest Pacific. And code breaking, signals intelligence allows many of those ships to be intercepted, sunk, and Japanese soldiers are killed that way. So thank you for the question. I know we've gone over.
And thank you to our panel. These gentlemen will be outside at the book signing station during this break, which is our lunch break. I recommend you check out our travel table as we have promotions for our springtime symposium on General George S. Patton, but also we have information on next year's international conference. The pre-conference symposium will be on FDR, and we have a couple of the highlighted speakers and topics already identified. Check that out and be back at 12:30 for the next session. Thank you very much.